Yes.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to join the workshop today. It feels like fall, and what should I do with my garden? Fall is my favorite time of the year. This is such a wonderful time when we get to reap the rewards of our growing season and take stock of what's gone well and also move into the more quiet, restful time of the year. So that will be the theme of our discussion today, all the tasks that need to be done right now. And fortunately, it's actually not that much. We've largely done the bulk of the growing, and now it's just a matter of cleaning things up and putting them to rest for the winter. Okay, so first task, we get to enjoy our summer bounty. We've got zucchinis that we can still harvest. Cut flowers are still blooming beautifully in the garden right now. Beans, kale, tomatoes, definitely, peppers, eggplants, corn maybe, melons and squash. Like, there's so much to harvest right now, if we've grown it in our garden, of course. But as we enjoy the fruits of our labor and are actively harvesting this fruit, we can also be mindful of collecting seed for next year. If you're growing any calendula or cilantro, lettuce, beans and peas, if any of those plants have done particularly well for you this year, and they're still forming their seed, it may be worth trying your hand at saving them. They are all self-fertile and have a low risk of cross-pollination. And as long as they're not a hybridized plant, they'll come true to seed next spring. And it's really a rewarding part of the season to continue the life cycle of the plant, thanking it for its generous harvest this year and preserving the seed for growing next year. Yeah, so those are things that we can do right now. And as we're enjoying this bounty, we can also start planting our fall garden. Of course, there is a caveat. We really should have done our fall planting before today. If we want kale for the winter, the last date to seed your kale is really in early August, so it can have enough time to mature before the fall. But yeah, as we've been harvesting, like, it's nice to actually plant successive crops. One thing, if you have some empty space in your garden, like at the base of your tomatoes perhaps, you can seed some cilantro or corn salad, arugula. You could still seed those things, and some winter lettuce. But you should do that like this week, and that's about as late as we can go in that seeding. Although, with that said, it never hurts to experiment. Why not throw seed down? Who's to say how the season will go? We may have a really warm patch, or the cold may come more quickly. So why not give the seeds the opportunity to grow and even if they don't reach their full maturity before the fall, if they're able to overwinter, in the spring you'll get a nice early harvest, which is great. Nothing is more refreshing than fresh greens in the early spring or late winter, when we really crave those green leafies. One master gardener in BC once described planting the fall garden as growing a living refrigerator. And that idea makes so much sense and just illustrates really nicely what the intention is and the timing. So we want to grow our winter plants to maturity before the fall sets in. Once the fall has set in, the cooler temperatures, the shorter daylight or day length really impedes a plant's ability to grow. It's not their season. So in order to enjoy a fresh harvest year-round, we have to get those plants established well before, and then they just stay at their maturity. They're able to weather the storm of winter well, and you get to pick your fresh produce throughout the year, which is really great. So I really like the idea of a living refrigerator. That's essentially what we're aiming to do. If you would still like kale for your garden and you didn't seed it in early August, you could look for transplants right now. Using liquid fertilizer to help feed those plants and get them established could be helpful. And then see what they're able to do before the fall really sets in. Yeah, as I was speaking with the host of this webinar, we were saying that there's only one more week of true summer. So yeah, we'll see if we get a nice warm fall or a cold and crisp fall. Yeah, things are moving along though. One thing to remember that in a month, I typically like to plant my garlic in late October to mid-November. Garlic is a wonderful thing to plant in the fall. So as you pull your tomatoes, if you have all your greens established and you have some later crops that you're pulling out, it's a great thing to put into the garden. It's really rewarding to have fresh garlic in the summer. And then we've got cover crops. If you don't really want to have to fuss with worrying about food crops over the winter, or the window has largely passed, you can sow some cover crops. A mix of fall rye and hairy vetch is really good for building the soil. The value of cover crops is that they're holding in the nutrients and helping stabilize and protect the soil over the winter. And here on the coast, we just get so much rain. So it's really critical to help stabilize the nitrogen and water-soluble nutrients in the tissues of plants over the course of the winter, so that in the spring, when we turn those over, that nutrition can be released back to our spring crops. So cover crops are really valuable, but they do take a little bit of awareness in the spring to know when you're gonna cut them back, and a little bit of effort to actually turn them over as well. But they're very helpful for building organic matter and soil health. Another cover cropping option is to sow fava beans. Around the time of planting your garlic, you can toss in some fava beans, and they'll be very short plants typically through the winter. And once again, they're holding some of that available nutrient in the soil in their plant tissues. So those nutrients aren't washed away in the winter rains, and they're helping stabilize that soil. And then in June, you actually get delicious fava beans, which are such a seasonal treat. So it's worth considering mixing and matching. Essentially, if you have a bed of salad mix or lettuces and greens, that's essentially a cover crop as well. Although the intention isn't as much on soil building and feeding, it is still serving as a nutrient sequestration tool and covering and stabilizing of the soil. So it can be fun to play with different methods, see what makes sense for your garden bed. Yeah, and one thing, as we're successively planting new crops throughout this season to fill our living refrigerator, it's good to be mindful of crop rotation. You know, brassicas, the family that has your kale, arugula, radishes, cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli. There's so many plants that fit into that family that we grow so regularly in our garden, and it's really important that we rotate that throughout our space, because clubroot, is such an unfortunate disease that can compromise the health of those plants for years, and it can take up to 20 years for clubroot to actually, its viability to be reduced in your soil. So it's really quite valuable to rotate those crops and be mindful of who's in what family so that we can avoid some of the soil-based diseases and pests. So the 4 families that are valuable to think of in that regard are your carrots, so that's cilantro, parsley, parsnip, dill. Typically they're all umbelliferae, so they've got those big umbel flowers that beneficial insects love, but that's a good way to identify those aside from cilantro. Tomatoes and the nightshade family are also valuable to rotate. You know, if you don't let tomatoes come up from seed in your garden, you could potentially get away with not actively rotating them. But late blight is such an issue, and it's so devastating to tomatoes and potatoes that it's well worth reducing the risk and just including a rotation plan to help prevent diseases and pests from building up in the soil. And then the last family is the onion family. So that's your garlic, scallions, leeks, things like that. So as you're successively moving through your garden and planting your new crops, just be mindful of those primary families and try to group them and move them throughout your garden over the course of the years you tend to your garden. And that can help. Of course, cleaning our gardening tools and be discerning about what plants and materials we bring into our garden can also be very helpful in terms of avoiding these diseases that can really throw a wrench in the gardening plan. in terms of planting garlic, you definitely want to check this year, if you are going to plant garlic, that the papery skin surrounding the cloves and the bulb are clean. There's no signs of black spotting or any whitish kind of rot. There's not any softness to the bulb. And that's a good way to ensure that you're planting clean seed garlic for next summer's harvest. So now that we've kind of planted our garden, or we're going to plant some cover crops and garlic, we get to nourish the soil. And I have to admit, this is my favorite part of the autumn. I love mulch. It is by far my favorite gardening task. It's just such a nice way to give back to the garden, thank it for all of its bounty, and make use of the abundant, generous supply of autumn leaves that we get here in the city. Trees have such deep roots, and they're putting all of their energy into these wonderful leaves, and then they give them to us for free every single fall. It's incredible. So generous. And it's nice to be able to take those leaves. I personally like to shred them. There's some debate, if you will, in terms of whether you shred your leaves or not. I personally like to shred the leaves so that they don't blow away as readily in the wind, and they break down more easily. I also find for aesthetics, some people prefer to have shredded leaves as opposed to large, bulky leaves. Regardless, whether they're shredded or not, those leaves provide really valuable protection for the soil over the course of the heavy winter rains. It's amazing to actually see a garden. If you want to do an experiment, you can in your garden. Leave one small little patch unmulched, and then mulch the rest of your garden. And in the spring, it's a palpable difference. The soil that has been protected is loose and light, easy to dig into with the fingers, and teeming with life. And soil that has been left bare essentially turns to concrete. You can often see the sandy particles, and it's not rich with organic matter. It doesn't have that life. And that soil is also much more prone to the extreme temperature fluctuations. So if you're not going to cover crop, or if the seeds didn't get started quite early enough, mulching is a really nice way to protect the soil and to feed it. And if you were to shred your leaves partially, in the winter, or I'm sorry, in the spring, when you come back to your garden, a good portion of those leaves will have already decomposed and become part of the soil, which is fantastic. And then you can just top dress it with some compost and prepare your seed beds if you want to. And yeah, start another season. So it's, I think mulch is probably one of the simplest ways to take care of our garden. So on the side of the screen, you can see the steps for autumn soil care. First off is to rake. It's nice to just like rake all of the debris from your bed, clean it up as you're cutting down any spent crops. If they've had any disease, it makes it easier to take those diseased leaves out. And it also gives you a clear view of any weeds that are growing in your garden. Weeding right before mulching is very satisfying because your efforts are then supported, because the mulch will actually prevent any new weed seeds from germinating. Perennial roots will have to push their way up through that mulch, weakening them that much more. So the time you spend weeding right before mulching is very valuable, and your efforts are definitely doubled, or the rewards of your efforts are certainly doubled. Yeah. So after weeding, my bias is to shred the leaves so they don't blow away, and you can also pack way more leaf litter on, and then to mulch. Yep. So because leaves fall for such a long time period, about 2 to 3 months, you can start by laying 1 to 2 inch layer around your plants, making sure to not bring the mulch up over the crown of your plant. Just keep it tapered and have a little space between that and where your mulch starts. And that'll help prevent, just allow airflow and prevent any rotting. And then as the season progresses and the weather gets colder, you can actually start to add more mulch on, and you don't have to worry about leaving the crowns exposed. You can actually bring the mulch right up to the base. Of course, I don't typically do that with lettuces or small greens. Yeah, but for kales and cabbages and things like that, it works quite well. And if you have any overwintering root crops like radishes or carrots, putting the mulch right over their shoulders will help prevent them from freezing and then rotting when they thaw. So yeah, mulching is a fantastic activity if you feel inspired. And then crop rotation, or I'm sorry, protection and extension can be really helpful. I myself really like the tunnels, especially if you have a raised garden bed with wooden sides. It's really easy to attach small little U-hooks or brackets and run PVC pipe across the width of your box, and then just have the opportunity to drape plastic over so that you can protect your Swiss chard, which doesn't always overwinter like that well. It can get kind of, the rain can take a little bit of a beating on your Swiss chard and softer greens like lettuce. So it's nice to have those under protection, and it just gives you a little bit more warmth and a little bit more active growth during those warmer parts of the winter. And they're just easy to use. If you wanted to, you could have 2 different lengths of piping. So for your tomatoes, it can be really valuable. Like for me this year, it would be so nice to extend the warm, dry period for my tomatoes because they've been so slow to ripen. So if I had a higher or a longer piece of piping, I could make a taller tunnel essentially to help keep the rain off of my tomatoes and keep them just a little bit warmer, so that maybe I could be harvesting the last of my ripe tomatoes in November, depending on what kind of fall we have. And then if you can have a shorter length of piping to drape over your greens, because you don't want large air pockets for your shorter greens. To keep it closer to the plant is actually helpful. Cloches and cold frames. Cloches are essentially, yeah, domes. They look like these water bottles with stakes running through them. That can be helpful if you want to protect a specific plant. Maybe if you have a basil and get like a cold snap that's coming in, and you just want to shelter it so you can get a little bit more of a harvest, that could be helpful. For the length of the winter though, I wouldn't use it. Most of the plants that we're growing over the winter, because they've already reached their maturity before the fall, they're able to withstand the cold temperatures. And we have such mild winters here. Our plants with mulch and a little bit of mindfulness around temperature extremes really don't need a lot of protection for the winter. But it really depends on what your situation is, what you're growing, and how much effort you would like to put into protecting your crops. Because if they don't get protection, they die back a little bit more aggressively during the winter. If their roots are fine, they will spring back in the spring, and you can have a nice fresh late winter salad without doing additional protection if you don't want to deal with that. But I'm quite partial to a tunnel with plastic over it. Being mindful that the plastic will help keep the rain off the tender green leafies, but you now have to water. And on a hot sunny day that we do get occasionally in the winter, you'll want to ventilate the tunnel as well. So it does require a little bit more maintenance, if you will. Easier if it's in your backyard or relatively close proximity. Here's just an interesting case study from Colorado. I'm originally from Colorado, and this is a picture of my family's garden. My mom and my sister have been carefully tending to this garden all summer. As you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, the zinnias and marigolds are beautiful. This was shot on Monday this week. It had just been 101 degrees Fahrenheit, so 48 or 40 degrees Celsius or so. On Monday night, it drops down in temperature to below freezing, and they actually receive 6 inches of snow. And on Wednesday, these pictures, the third column of pictures, were taken today by my mother. And you can see that my sister and my mom's efforts to actually put plastic over the garden, they really just threw it down, anchored it, didn't have any additional stakes or supports. But them doing that allowed their garden to actually withstand that extreme temperature fluctuation and the additional weight of the snow. Had they not put that plastic out over the garden, I think they would have sustained maybe a little bit more, certainly more damage on their annual crops. The perennials, one section of their garden they didn't actually cover, and those perennials withstood it well. But the annuals, the marigolds, the zinnias, they certainly would not have appreciated that snowfall. So that's a good testament to the value of timely and appropriate winter protection. You know, typically here we don't need it all winter. If we want to do it all winter, we can. But in those extreme storms, it is helpful to protect our crops, and it really can make a difference in sustaining our production and harvest. So that was just an interesting fluctuation from this week in Colorado. Now that we've gone over the basics of what we should be doing this fall, this is a great time to plant, divide, and transplant perennials and bulbs. If you would like to grow tulips or crocuses or daffodils, any of those wonderful spring bulbs, this is a great time to plant those in your containers and in the garden soil if you would like. And if you've got, you know, a patch of irises or black-eyed Susans that are doing beautifully but are maybe taking over a bit, this is really handy to lift those perennials in about like a month's time. Yeah, mid to late October into early November can be a fine time to divide and transplant perennials. So if you wanted to do that, you could either cut off a section of the clump in the ground, or you could lift the whole clump and cut it into portions and then replant those portions and pot up new ones to give to friends or whatnot. But this is a great time to do that. Also, if you want to get any perennial fruits established, planting fruit trees and berries is great at this time of year. So if you want to perennialize your garden, if you have perennial sections of your garden, this is a great time to do that. And then, of course, as we get closer to freezing temperatures, it's good to clear your irrigation lines. I like to store irrigation timers as well, so detaching those from the spigots, and you can unscrew the casing for your irrigation timers and let them air dry inside the house, and then store them in the garage or another dry space for the winter. And that can really help with the longevity of your irrigation timers. Same with hose nozzles. It's always just a bummer when a freeze happens and you have to replace your hose nozzles or a pipe burst. Of course, I think this is like my Colorado heritage coming through, because typically we don't really have to deal with that here in Vancouver. But it was such a deeply ingrained part of my upbringing that I'm always hyper cognizant of draining irrigation lines and turning off outdoor water sources. But you can, yeah, do what you need to do. Also, if any of you use Oyas, terracotta gourds for subterranean irrigation methods, it's great to lift those after your crops are done and clean them and dry them and then store them in a dry place for the winter. And that'll just help prevent the terracotta from freezing and thawing and shattering. So that can be helpful. Also a nice time to do some tool care. If you've been using your snips a lot this summer, it's always nice to give them a good sharpen and oil and cleaning so that they're raring to go in the spring or in the late winter for any pruning that you need to do. Yeah, it's good to take note that we should always clean our digging tools and secateurs on a regular basis after we use them in the garden, especially if we're going into communal spaces or using them in other people's gardens. Always valuable to clean our tools regularly. And in the winter, of course, we just get to do the luxurious tool treatment, so they're really ready to go when we need them next year. And then, you know, this time of the year is so lovely for reflecting on the season. What went really well in your garden this year? Tomatoes, I can't say they did particularly well for me this year, but my basil was amazing. So it's nice to just take stock. Is there a crop that you thought would do really well that didn't? If so, do you want to try it again next year, or is there another crop that you would love to give a try? Yeah, did your irrigation system work well? You know, just would you like more flowers mixed into your vegetables? Whatever it is, it's just nice to reflect on. If you happen to take notes on how much you invested in your garden and how much harvest you were able to reap, that can be a really interesting fall, winter retrospective exercise, and can provide some valuable motivation when you see how well something did, or realize that maybe it's just easier to buy corn at the farmer's market and don't worry about growing it yourself, you know? Yeah, but in our garden journals, we can keep those notes of our crop rotation, where we planted our brassicas, where we planted our carrots, etc. And then just plan our succession for next year. Yeah, if you want to do a garden expansion, this is a really nice time to play with design ideas and yeah, reflect. And that's about it for the workshop today. But I'll pitch the next workshop, which is going to be on October 9th via Zoom, and it will be a workshop giving thanks for life itself and the bounty of autumn. And we'll be making little pumpkin floral arrangements, and all of the materials will be put together in a kit. You're welcome to harvest foliage and flowers from your own gardens. And then we'll just guide everyone through how to make a nice little centerpiece for Thanksgiving. Yeah, and if there's any questions, I would be glad to answer them. And also just thanks everyone for taking the time to attend today.